Hello, welcome back to the channel. So as you can see, I'm clutching a copy of the Masquerade Mind's Eye Theatre Rules. So it's another video in my Storytellers series talking about things you can do as a storyteller to enhance your game and enhance your personal skills as a storyteller. So today I'm going to talk about feeding campaign. So specifically for vampire. Why is a feeding campaign important? Well, blood. Blood is the life, to quote something. Every vampire background mythos, the vampires take blood. That's their modus operandi. If you ask anybody about vampire, they'll probably say drink blood, turn into bats. They're the main things people know about vampire. Vampire the Masquerade is no exception. In fact, I would even go to the fact to say the biggest threat perhaps to the Masquerade being uncovered is feeding and feeding not getting treated well. Now, I've seen various games do this in various ways. And the simplest way that most games do it is give me a test. If you win, you're on full blood. If you lose, you're on half blood. And if you draw, you're on 3/4 blood. And for me, that was never satisfactory considering how important feeding is to vampires. Vampires exist in the gilded cage of the city. It's not that easy to travel between other cities and domains. And when you get outside the city limits, the population density is much lower. So there's less opportunity to feed. So you're trapped in a city as an alpha predator surrounded by other alpha predators, having to think about and maintain the masquerade, which means you cannot just feed at will whilst competing for those feeding resources with other vampires. That's my thoughts and feelings on it. So what I did was devise a system, a feeding campaign, which I'm going to cover in detail and show you behind the curtains today, and allows you to create that as a bit of a mechanical system so you can ascertain how impactful that is. Is it overfeeding? Is there risks to masquerade? Is areas underfeeding? But also allow players to really start to engage with and think about their feeding and keep it at the forefront of their mind. The other thing that the feeding campaign does is it's going to support the Camarilla structure. So this is kind of Camarilla and Anarchy thought if you're running games. So that would be completely different because generally they're not following the Masquerade as much, but they will have some sort of purchase pact. And with any competition for resources, station and standing should and does matter. So let's get into it. So I started off creating this for the Darlington game. So in case you don't know, Darlington is a town in the northeast of England, 110,000 people. So actually in terms of the World of Darkness, we push those numbers up a bit and stuff as well, ratios and stuff for vampires to humans. Anyway, what we did was I split it up into areas. And that's a key to the feeding campaign area, is having your domain, your city split up into key areas. What I did for my game was I looked at council wards in the town centre, the urban area. So that gave us 17 areas already subdivided onto a map, and it meant that I didn't have to go and plan and draw a map, and players could easily access online the sort of town council wards, and accessibility is a thing. They were waffling there, but let's crack on. Now, I've also used a version of this for Dark Age vampires. I ran Dark Age vampires, even though I was living in Glasgow at the time, set in the northeast of England. And I think what I did at the time was use parishes for the feeding campaign, because each parish was based around a village. And obviously you had some towns and stuff in there as well. So there's lots of different things you can do. Maybe parishes might work for your city. Have a think about how many zones you want and areas. You don't want so many that and you don't want so few. I found 17 to 20 being the sweet spot, and you'll see why in a minute. So 17 areas. Now, what I did with those was designate one of them to be the rack, and this is often the city centre, downtown, if you're in America, apart from Philadelphia, where it's a city centre. I found out when I was writing my Philadelphia game. And what the rack is, That's a place where feeding is plentiful, and most vampires are allowed to feed as long as they're acknowledged by the prince. Second thing it did was pick 3 areas where kind of industry was heavy, or it might be more rural areas, and we designated those the barrens. So nobody's going to get those. Feeding is harder in the barrens, Barrens, not barons for anarch leaders. So feeding is probably more problematic in there, and often the dregs of vampire society will kind of hang around the barrens, or people, vampires trying to stay off the radar, will be in the barrens. So that gives us 13 areas. So if we're thinking about scope then for the game, the prince is going to have their own personal feeding area, maybe a couple of other high status kindred, which then leaves you about 10 areas, 7 Camarilla clans, plus a few extra to play around with. So what I did was talk to the prince about what we were doing, how we're going to set it up, because it's a prince's domain. So over the course of a couple of sessions, each clan was able to kind of bid and make offers for various areas. So every clan was going to end up with an area, depending on what they were, and what they offered depended on what they got. So some clans were really organised, ended up with 2 or 3 areas, and some clans were less organised, ended up with 1. So there was always areas for them to feed on. It's also worth noting at this point that it's feeding rights, not domain rights. So Camarilla, the prince has domain over the city. So the prince wasn't subletting the rights of domain to other vampires. So what that looked like is the mountain area of Darlington, for example, was probably feeding rights to I think it was a Tremere. And it meant the Tremere had exclusive feeding rights in there. Any vampire found feeding in there would owe them boons or favours, or it could be escalated to the hierarchy of the city. But you could pass through there as a vampire because that right was the domain. And often the only piece of domain you're granted in a prince's domain is your haven. The other thing what I did to make each area a bit more interesting was associate each one an influence bonus. So in Mind's Eye Theatre, the city is split up into loads of different influences for everything from academics and bureaucracy through to underworld and occult to health, politics, police, the whole gamut. And it meant that you had easier access to those influences, and there's a wee bonus there. And what that represented was, let's say you were hunting in the academic area, and it's the academic area because the main college was there. There'd be lots of students maybe drinking in the local pubs around it. So if you're feeding in that area, then you're going to overhear things and rumours and stuff. So it just makes that easier. Or let's say you have like an area of heavy industry. You know, the workers after work going to go down the pub and again chat. A lot of British culture revolves around the pubs, in case you haven't guessed, for all my international viewers there. Go down the pub and again chatting about what's happening and stuff, and maybe you can start to know some people and pull some favours. Which meant that when the clans were bidding as well, they could take that into account. So yeah, saw the Tremere kind of going towards the more scholarly areas, and the Bruja going to the more streety areas. Gives your city a lot of flavour and feeling, and make those areas feel kind of unique to each other. Now what we then went on and did, and I appointed an assistant storyteller who could do feeding at the start of every game. You went to the assistant storyteller at every game, and every character did this, and you assigned a number of points to different areas, and you could do it to any area you wanted. So if you wanted to start on Half-Blood, you assigned 1 point. If you could start on 3/4 of your blood and assign 3 points, and you could start on full blood and assign 6 points. What those points did was start adding up and building up. And if I saw particular areas having much higher and significant impact on vampire feeding, what I then would do was start creating rumours about potential masquerade breaches in the city. And what that looked like could be, depending how the players fed, is incidents of mugging is up in this area, or the university is concerned because a lot of students are struggling with the grades, and when they're being investigated, there's anemia, or maybe there's a bloodborne disease going around populations and stuff. So hopefully the vampires would notice that and start dealing with it and wheeling and dealing with each other about how they could handle that. So maybe your clan's only got one area, and your clan, the Malkavians, suddenly had a massive burst of numbers, and you're struggling to get the players, to get the characters kind of fed, and so you might need to go, actually, Clan Ventru, we would like to be able to share your feeding rights in the Northgate area. And for this, we will offer you boons and stuff, because at the moment we're struggling with the Malkavian numbers in the city. Now, when you assigned your feeding points to the assistant storyteller, you talked about how you were going to do it, what your primary mode of feeding was. And you would do a test, stone, scissors, paper test, being at the heart of the Mind's Eye Theatre system. If you won, boom, happy days, your feeding has gone off the way you've described it. Again, that allows you to always, at the start of the game, think about yourself, well, your character, as a vampire hunting, putting that kind of thoughts in your head. If you drew, it still went off, but it was minor complications, so you have +1 to that masquerade threat index. If you failed, you could use a retest based on how you were going to be feeding. So, for example, if you were a seductive vampire, you might have a retest based on subterfuge, or if you had some presence powers. If you were mugging, you might have a brawl test, for example, or feeding from animals, obviously animal ken as a retest, or animalism as a retest. And that also meant that the assistant storyteller could run a mini scene with you as well and talk about how that's gone on, how you dealt with it, and just delve a bit more detail into the night-to-night work of being a vampire. Now, what to do with those numbers as a threat starts building up, I kind of alluded to it earlier, is first up, you can start making the players' characters feel like they're under pressure. You know, you're when they say, oh, well, we could put 6 in Malden this month, you're like, are you, ooh, okay, that's quite a lot. Are you sure you wanna kind of put that much threat on the masquerade? Oh, well, I'm sheriff. I should have 6 blood. Who knows what's going to happen? I should always be on full blood. Well, you know what? You run around on full blood there, cowboy. You're gonna put a threat on you. You know that blood's got to come from somewhere. So what impact is that going to have on the population? So as the numbers raise, start raising clues and stories about masquerade things. So, for example, a good one could be if your vampire is a young vampire feeding exclusively from animals, there might be pets going missing, or fox or badger carcasses left out, or there could be like posters of, have you seen my golden retriever missing? And that gives you a sense of what's happening, and that player agency. You know, I've talked about this in other videos. I did a questionnaire with a load of players about what they wanted and what they enjoyed from games, and most of them came back with saying, I want player agency to feel like my actions impact the story and matter, and this is a way you can make that happen. The other thing we had was players could use their influencers to kind of make feeding easier or harder in areas. And again, me and the assistant storyteller will talk about what that would look like and affect the feeding tests and stuff. So, for example, you could get your councillors, your bureaucracy influence to not fund street lamps repair in a certain area. So it becomes quite dark and kind of easier for you to do your mugging. Or you could get more police in different zones. There's been a spate of crime, so we're going to get more police on the street. So again, it's harder for certain types to feed. And again, you can use your influence in loads of creative ways to raise or lower how easy it would be in different cities zones. And one of the things I really like about players and downtimes and this sort of thing is players will constantly surprise you by really cool ideas, and where possible say yes and what else is going to happen. Now, players can feed where they want as well, so this puts another interesting spin on the campaign. So, for example, Charles the Malkavian is wanting to cause some grief for the Ventrue. So Charles the Malkavian is constantly going into the Ventrue area and feeding. So he's going to subtly start increasing the threat rating there for the Ventrue. And the Ventrue might be really organised and thinking, right, I've got all my clan in order, kind of working. I know who's feeding where. Why is the Masquerade struggling? What's going on? And that could be a way to embarrass the Ventrue Primogen who can't keep his clan in order when actually it's Charles the Malkavian going and doing some Charles the Malkavian things. And that might encourage players in the downtime to say, well, actually, you know what, I'm going to put some eyes out. I'm going to kind of have some people patrolling, looking around, seeing what's going on. Is there any vampires out there feeding where there shouldn't be? Or even setting traps for, if you know there's a gamekeepering and poaching, good name for vampires going into the zones. So groundkeeping, I do apologise. We don't like gatekeepers in any of our hobbies. Groundkeeping and poachers. So what's going on? That can create some really interesting tensions and storylines and interactions as well. Because anything you do in terms of downtime and feeding should be about A, reinforcing the themes of the game, in this case vampire, and B, all about giving your players an opportunity to interact more and have better and more interesting things happen that they can deal with in terms of the game. One final thing with the feeding as well is over time, once it starts building up with the assistant storyteller, what we started looking at was patterns. So vampires who regularly fed less, we would start to consider that in terms of their humanity and what they were doing and the motivations behind that, and if they were on paths and ways to increase their humanity, not paths, if they were on humanity, a journey, I meant to say instead of path, to increase the humanity, that could be taken into account. But if you were constantly on full blood, you are not seeing people as people anymore. You're starting to see them just as a resource to keep yourself at full blood. So that would start affecting your humanity as well. I always said 3/4 was the sweet spot. You know, as people, we never walk around with pork pie, and every time we felt the pang of hunger, we scoffed that pork pie and made sure we had more pork pies. We travel between meals and we top up on meals. So I always said, you know, the default position in my games for Vampire was 3/4. So if you were constantly on full blood, what impact is that having on you as a psyche, and what's that going to be doing to your humanity ratings? Now, if a player couldn't make it for whatever reason, their vampire would still be feeding, so we just kept a record of where that vampire fed last and how they fed last, and we factored that into the account as well. So your population of vampires is always going on whether they make it to your court in your games or not. So there you have it, a really simple but effective feeding campaign that I know my players really enjoyed, came back to me. So the key things was split your city into zones, have an assistant to help you, get players to describe how they're feeding and where they're feeding, use those points to kind of get a straw feel for how the masquerade threat is feeling, and depending on the feel of the game you want, you can have that affect different things at different levels. I don't like to tie myself to numbers, but I think numbers are healthy as like an indicator of things, and that's how I like to see numbers, rather than say, well, this has to happen because this numbers hit this. Story trumps all, in my opinion. But anyway, that is my video on feeding campaigns. I hope that's useful. If you want to ask me any questions about it, go ahead. I ran this successfully for many years, like I said, from both Dark Ages, live action. I think I even ran a version of it in the Sabbat, but that, again, you know, that wee bit different with the Sabbat. But anyway, you have a great time. I look forward to chatting to you again. That's bye for now. Bye bye.